The world had a sound. Lena had always believed that. It was in the gentle rustle of the tall prairie grass as the wind swept down from the mesas, a sound like the world exhaling a long, contented sigh. It was in the steady, rhythmic creak of the windmill Elias had built with his own two hands, its blades spinning a tireless lullaby against the vast, empty blue of the sky. It was in the low, contented nicker of their mare, Daisy, in the small but sturdy barn, and the cheerful clucking of the hens scratching in the dust. Most of all, it was in the sound of Elias's voice, a low, warm baritone that could soothe a spooked horse or make a story told by the fireside feel like the most important tale ever spun. For 5 years, these sounds had been the bricks and mortar of her life, building a home, a sanctuary, in a land that was notoriously unforgiving. Now, all she could hear was the silence. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. It was a hostile silence, born from the deafening roar of gunshots that had shattered the afternoon peace. It was the silence left behind by the thunder of a dozen shod hooves, the cruel laughter of wicked men, and the final, agonized gasp of the only man she had ever loved. She remained crouched in the dark, musty confines of the root cellar, her body wedged between barrels of salted pork and sacks of potatoes. The thick, oak cellar door above her was still closed, a flimsy barrier against the horror that had unfolded just feet away. She had been there for what felt like an eternity, her knuckles right where she gripped the handle of a rusty spade, the only weapon she could find. She had listened, paralyzed, as the world of sound she cherished was systematically dismantled. It had started with the dogs. A sudden, frantic barking, cut short by two sharp cracks of a pistol. Then, the voices. Loud, coarse, and arrogant. She had peeked through a crack in the cabin wall and seen them. A dozen hard-faced men on horseback, their clothes caked in trail dust, their eyes cold and predatory. And at their lead, a man with a black patch over his right eye, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. She had never seen him before, but she felt a chill of recognition. This was the man Elias sometimes spoke of in hushed tones, the ghost from a past life he had tried so hard to leave behind. One-Eye Jack Clanton. Elias had shoved her towards the cellar. Lena, go. Now. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me? No matter what. His face was grim, a mask of cold resolve she had only seen glimpses of before. It was the face of the man he used to be, U.S. Marshal Elias Thorne. He had tried to bury that man out here in this small patch of earth they called home, but the past had a long memory and had finally ridden into their yard. She had heard the confrontation. Elias's voice, calm and steady, a rock against the tide of their taunts. This is my home now, Jack. There's nothing for you here. One-Eye Jack's laughter was a grating, ugly sound. Nothing for me. You took 10 years of my life, Thorne. 10 years in the hellhole of Yuma, staring at a stone wall with one eye because of you. I figure you owe me a little more than nothing. I'm here for payment. And I always collect. Then came the sounds of the fight. The sickening crunch of a fist against bone. Elias's grunt of pain. The splintering of the porch rail. Lena's entire body had trembled, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She had wanted to burst out of the cellar, to fight, to do something, but his last command held her fast, no matter what. It was an oath. And then, the gunshots. A cacophony of them. 1, 2, then a volley. It was not a duel. It was an execution. After the shots, there was a heavy, final thud. And then the silence began. She heard them ransacking the cabin above her. The smashing of the china her mother had given her. The tearing of the quilt she had spent a winter stitching. They were not just robbing them, they were erasing them. They took their food, their water, their future. And then came the last, cruelest sound. The triumphant shout from one of the men. Got it, Jack. The marshal's peacemaker. Pretty thing, ain't it? A trophy. They had taken his life, and now they had taken the symbol of what he had once stood for. The final insult. The smell of smoke began to seep through the cracks in the cellar door. Acrid and thick. They had fired the barn. She could hear the terrified whinnying of Daisy, a sound that tore at her heart, before it too was swallowed by the roar of the flames and the jeering laughter of the gang as they rode away. Lena didn't know how long she waited after the last hoofbeat faded into the distance. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the before, and the suffocating, silent now. Finally, driven by the thickening smoke and the unbearable quiet, she pushed open the heavy door. The world she emerged into was a nightmare landscape painted in the brutal hues of the setting sun. The sky was a blaze of orange and crimson, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding in sympathy. The cabin was a wreck, its door torn from the hinges, its contents strewn across the yard. The barn was a roaring inferno, a funeral pyre for their animals and their dreams, sending a column of black smoke into the pristine sky. And there, lying in the dust halfway between the cabin and the burning barn, was Elias. He was face down, one arm outstretched as if reaching for the home he had died to protect. His blue work shirt was stained a dark, terrible red. For a moment, Lena couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. This could not be her Elias, the man who could lift her off her feet with a laugh, whose hands were strong enough to forge steel but gentle enough to tend a sick calf. But it was. A wave of grief, so powerful and so absolute it was like a physical blow hit her. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, a guttural, animalistic wail tearing from her throat, a sound of such profound agony that it seemed to mock the silence that had preceded it. She crawled to him, her hands shaking, and gently turned him over. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the blood-red sky. His face, even in death, held a look of defiance. But his holster, the one that was a permanent fixture on his hip, was empty. She knelt there, cradling his head in her lap, rocking back and forth as the flames from the barn cast a flickering, hellish light on the scene. The world had been reduced to this single, horrific tableau: a dead husband, a burning home, and a broken wife. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime and soot that already stained her skin. She wept for the life they had built, for the children they would never have, for the sound of his voice she would never hear again. She wept until she had no tears left, until her throat was dry and her body was hollowed out, a mere shell of sorrow. And then, as the last of the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, something shifted within her. The grief was still there, a vast, cold ocean inside her. But at its center, a new island was forming. It was hard and sharp and cold. It was rage. A rage so pure and so potent it burned away the last of her tears. Her gaze fell again upon his empty holster. They had taken it as a trophy. They had laughed. They had ridden away, leaving her for dead, believing she was nothing more than a homesteader's wife, a helpless woman who would be consumed by the wilderness or her own sorrow. They were wrong. Elias had not just taught her how to cook and sew. He was a man haunted by his past, a man who knew the world was filled with wolves. And he had been determined that his wife would not be a sheep. Hope for the best, Lena, he used to say as they practiced with the rifle at the far end of their property, but prepare for the worst. The worst has a way of finding you when you least expect it. He had taught her how to load and fire a gun until the motions were second nature. He had taught her how to track, how to read the subtle signs of the land: a broken twig, a disturbed stone, the depth of a hoofprint. He taught her how to move without a sound, how to use the sun and shadows to her advantage. He had taught her how to survive. He had been preparing her for a war he had prayed would never come. The grief that had hollowed her out now became a vessel. The sorrow did not leave, it simply made room for a cold, hard purpose. The meek wife who had tended her garden and collected eggs died there in the dust, beside her husband. And from her ashes, a hunter was born. Her movements became methodical, devoid of the frantic energy of grief. She gently closed Elias's eyes, kissing his cold forehead one last time. She could not leave him for the coyotes. Using the spade from the cellar, she began to dig. She dug all through the night, her muscles screaming, her hands blistering and bleeding, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel the only sound in the world. She dug until the sky began to bleed from black to gray in the east. She wrapped Elias in their finest quilt, the one they saved for the coldest winter nights, and laid him to rest in the hard and forgiving earth he had loved. There was no preacher, no prayers. Her vow, made in silence, was the only eulogy he would receive. As the sun's first rays crested the mountains, casting long shadows across the ravaged homestead, she did not rest. She walked to the far side of the cabin, to a loose stone at the base of the foundation. She pried it free. There, wrapped in oilcloth, were the tools of Elias's other life, the ones he had taught her to use. A Schofield Model 3 revolver, a weapon he favored for its quick reloading, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. A Winchester 1873 rifle, its lever action smooth and reliable. And several boxes of ammunition. She strapped the gun belt around her waist. It felt alien and yet perfectly natural. She went back into the ruined cabin and gathered what she could: a water skin, a pouch of dry jerky, a whetstone, and a map Elias had meticulously drawn of the surrounding territory. She put on his worn leather duster, which smelled faintly of hemifwood smoke, leather, and earth. It felt like an embrace and an armor all at once. Finally, she walked to the makeshift grave, marked only by a simple cross she had fashioned from the pieces of the splintered porch rail. She stood there for a long moment, not in sorrow, but in grim resolve. "I will not say goodbye, my love," she whispered to the silent earth, her voice a raw, cracked thing. "Because I will not be done with you until every man who did this is in the ground with you. That is my promise." Her grief was not her grave. It was her compass. It was her shield. It was the whetstone upon which her purpose would be honed to a razor's edge. She found one of their horses, a young buckskin, grazing nervously at the edge of the property, having broken free from the corral in the chaos. She approached him slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. He was all she had left. She swung herself into the saddle, her movements fluid and sure. She did not look back at the smoking ruins of her home or the fresh grave that held her heart. There was nothing left for her there. She turned the horse west, the direction the gang had ridden. The sun was at her back, casting her long, solitary shadow before her. The outlaws had made her a widow. They had left her with nothing. They believed she was the last, forgotten victim of their rampage. They had no idea she was the beginning of their end. The hunt had begun. The prairie was a harsh and impartial teacher. It taught lessons of thirst, of some blasted days that bled into bone-chilling nights, and of a profound, soul-crushing loneliness that could drive a person mad. For 3 days, Lena rode, and the prairie taught her its lessons. But Elias had been a harsher teacher, and his lessons had been designed to conquer this very landscape. She rationed her water, sipping only when her tongue felt thick and dry, ignoring the phantom craving that was the first sign of panic. She ate the jerky sparingly, the salty, tough meat a poor substitute for the warm bread and stew she was used to, but it was fuel, and she was a machine that now required it. At night, she did not build a fire. A fire was a beacon for the very men she hunted, a comfort she could not afford. Instead, she would find a shallow arroyo or a cluster of rocks, wrap herself in Elias's duster, and lie with the loaded Schofield in her hand, her sleep a light, brittle thing, easily broken by the snap of a twig or the distant howl of a coyote. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. But it no longer crippled her. It had become a lens, focusing her mind with a terrifying clarity. Her senses, always sharp, were now honed to a razor's edge. She saw the world as Elias had taught her to see it, as a series of signs, a story written on the land. The trail left by the Clanton gang was a brutal scar on the prairie, easy for even a novice to follow. A dozen horses, heavily laden, left a wide, churned path of trampled grass and displaced earth. But Lena looked closer, seeking the details. She saw the discarded whiskey bottle, the carelessly dropped cigar butt. They were arrogant, sloppy. They believed they had no reason to fear a pursuit. They did not know she existed. This was her greatest advantage. On the 4th day, the wide trail split. A single set of tracks veered north, while the main group continued west. She dismounted, her eyes scanning the ground. The lone horse's tracks were deeper on the left side, indicating a rider who favored that stirrup, perhaps due to an old injury. The horse had a distinctive nick in its right for horseshoe. And alongside the prints, she saw something else, a small, dark stain in the dust. Tobacco juice. She remembered one of the men distinctly, a lanky outlaw with a stained, yellowing grin who had spat a stream of tobacco just before they'd shot her dogs. He was the one who had let out a triumphant whoop as he'd found Elias's gun. She remembered his high-pitched, grating laugh. Her decision was instantaneous. The pack could wait. Vengeance was not a feast to be consumed all at once, it was a dish to be served one plate at a time. She turned her horse north, her focus now narrowed to a single point. She tracked him for another day. He was heading for the mining outpost of dusty despair known as Scorpion Gulch, likely to spend his share of the loot on whiskey and women. He was moving slower now, confident he was safe. This made him vulnerable. The hunter in Lena, the part of her that Elias had so carefully cultivated, knew that patience was the sharpest weapon in her arsenal. She caught up to him at dusk, finding him camped by a small, muddy watering hole, the only source of water for miles. The horse with the nicked shoe was tethered nearby, and the man was crouched over a small, smoky fire, cooking a piece of salt pork. He was humming a tuneless, jaunty song, completely at ease. And there, tucked into his belt, was Elias's Colt Peacemaker, its familiar ivory grip seeming to mock her from across the clearing. A red haze threatened to cloud Lena's vision. The primal urge to raise her rifle and end him from a distance was overwhelming. But that was not the plan. An ambush from afar was impersonal. It was the kind of death they had given Elias. This man deserved something more intimate. He deserved to know why. She tethered her own horse a quarter-mile back, taking only the Schofield and knife Elias had made for her from a railroad spike, and a length of rope. She moved through the twilight, her footsteps as silent as a falling shadow. The lessons came back to her: stay downwind, use the cover of the rocks and scrub, move only when the wind rustles the grass. She circled his camp, approaching from the opposite side of the horse, using its body as her final piece of cover. She was 20 feet away. 10. She could smell his greasy hair and the cheap whiskey on his breath. The moment was now. He never heard her. She rose from her crouch like a phantom, covering the last few feet into silent strides. She didn't use the gun. She slammed the butt of the Schofield hard against the side of his head. There was a dull, wet thud, and he collapsed forward into his fire with a surprised grunt, scattering embers and sending his half-cooked meal into the dirt. She dragged him back from the flames, his body limp. He was unconscious, a thin trickle of blood matting his hair. She worked quickly, efficiently. She pulled Elias's Peacemaker from his belt, the familiar weight of it in her hand both a comfort and a fresh stab of pain. She holstered it on her own hip, where it belonged. Then she took his own gun, emptied it, and threw it far into the scrub brush. Using the rope, she bound his hands and feet with the tight, non-slip knots Elias had taught her. She waited. For an hour, she sat on a rock and watched him, her face an emotionless mask, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the slow breathing of the unconscious man. When he finally stirred, groaning, his head lolling to the side, his eyes struggling to focus, he found her sitting there, the Schofield resting calmly in her lap. Its muzzle pointed directly at his heart. Confusion warred with fear on his face. Who the hell are you? Does the name Thorne mean anything to you? Lena's voice was a low, gravelly thing she barely recognized as her own. His eyes widened in recognition, then in utter terror. He remembered. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not just a woman, but the ghost from the homestead they had burned. The marshal's wife, he stammered, his body beginning to tremble. We thought you were, we didn't. You thought I was what? She pressed, her voice dangerously soft. Dead? Helpless? You laughed. I heard you. You laughed when you murdered my husband. You laughed when you stole his gun. She patted the ivory grip of the Peacemaker on her hip. My husband's gun. He began to babble, pleading for his life. It wasn't me. It was One-Eye Jack. He gave the order. I was just following orders. Mom, I swear. I got a family. So did I, Lena said, and the cold finality in her voice silenced him. I have two questions for you. You will answer them truthfully. Your life depends on it. Where is the rest of the gang headed? And what is their plan? Terrified, the man, whose name she learned was Smiley Pete, told her everything. He told her the main gang was heading for the lawless border town of Purgatory Flats to lie low and sell off their stolen goods. He told her about One-Eye Jack's plan of final, big score, a payroll wagon heading for the silver mines in the north, after which they would scatter to the winds forever. He gave her the details, the timeline, everything. When he was done, he looked at her with desperate, pleading eyes. There. I told you. Now you'll let me go, right? Lena stood up. She looked down at the pathetic, trembling man at her feet. She thought of Elias lying in the dust, of the smoke, of the laughter. She thought of the promise she had made over his grave. Elias was a man of the law, she said, her voice a near whisper. He believed in trials and judges. But the law died with him in our yard. Out here, there's only the crime and the punishment. You were his executioner. I am your judge." She turned and walked away. "Wait," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "What are you doing? You can't just leave me here." She stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked back at him, her silhouette dark against the star-dusted sky. "I'm not leaving you," she said. She held up his empty canteen, which she had quietly drained while he was unconscious, and poured the last of its water onto the thirsty ground. "I'm just giving you the same chance you gave my husband." She walked away without another word, not looking back. His screams and curses followed her, growing more and more frantic, until they were just another pathetic sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt only a grim, cold emptiness. The first name had been crossed off her ledger. There were 11 more to go. Purgatory Flats was not so much a town as a festering sore on the face of the territory. It was a place where the law was a rumor and gold was God. Its single, dusty street was lined with ramshackle saloons, a grimy hotel, and a mercantile that dealt more in ammunition than in flour. It was a haven for men on the run, a place to disappear, and the perfect kennel for the Clanton gang. Lena stood on a rocky bluff overlooking the town, her spyglass of Elias's tools pressed to her eye. It had taken her 2 days of hard riding to get here. Smiley Pete's information had been good. She saw their horses tied outside the largest saloon, the Devil's Den. Through the grimy windows, she could see them carousing, their laughter spilling out into the street. They were celebrating their victory, confident and secure. Her hand rested on the ivory grip of Elias's peacemaker. The temptation to ride down there, to kick open the saloon doors and unleash hell, was a burning fire in her gut. But that would be suicide. They were a pack of wolves, and she was a lone hunter. She could not beat them with brute force. She had to be smarter. She had to become the ghost they were already starting to whisper about. The body of Smiley Pete had been found by a prospector, dead from thirst, his hands still bound. The story had trickled into Purgatory Flats, a strange tale of a man left to die with an empty canteen. It was dismissed as a bizarre but remarkable frontier tragedy. No one connected it to the raid on the Thorne homestead. Not yet. Lena's plan was not to attack them directly, but to attack their confidence. She would dismantle them from the outside in, piece by piece. She would turn their sanctuary into a trap. She spent the day observing, learning the town's rhythms. She watched as one of the gang members, a huge, bearded man they called Grizzly, bullied his way through the street, shoving a drunkard out of his path. She watched another, young, nervous-looking kid with shifty eyes, buy a new shirt at the mercantile. She cataloged their faces, their mannerisms, burning them into her memory. Each one was a future grave marker. Her first target was not a man, but their means of escape, their horses. That night, under the cover of a new moon, she slipped into town, a shadow among shadows. She moved with a preternatural quietness, her boots making no sound in the thick dust. In a pouch, she carried a handful of dried burrs, their tiny hooks sharp and irritating. She reached the hitching rail outside the Devil's Den. The horses stood quietly, dozing in the cool night air. Working quickly, she slipped a few of the sharp burrs under the saddle blanket of each horse, positioning them where they would dig into the animal's back the moment a rider's weight was applied. It was a simple, cruel trick, but it would create chaos when she needed it most. Her second task was psychological. She crept to the side of the saloon, to a window where one-eyed Jack Clanton sat playing poker, his back to the wall, his single eye scanning the room. He had a stack of coins in front of him and a glass of whiskey at his elbow. Next to the glass lay a single playing card he used to mark his place, the ace of spades, the death card. Lena retreated to the opposite side of the street, finding cover in the deep shadows of a blacksmith's awning. She rested her Winchester rifle on the smithy's anvil, the cold iron a steadying presence. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, just as Elias had taught her. She wasn't aiming for Jack. She was aiming for his arrogance. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that shattered the night's quiet. Inside the saloon, the poker game exploded in chaos. Men dove for cover, overturning tables. One-Eyed Jack instinctively drew his gun, his eye darting around for the source of the shot. And then he saw it. His whiskey glass had exploded, showering the table in shards and liquor. And there, perfectly centered in the ace of spades, was a single, clean bullet hole. It was not an attack. It was a message. It said, "I can reach you whenever I want. I can see you. You are not safe." Before the shock had even registered, Lena initiated the second phase of her plan. She fired another shot into the air. This was the signal. Across town, a small bundle of oil-soaked rags she had planted earlier in a wagon full of hay went up with a whoosh. Flames leaped into the sky, creating a terrifying and brilliant diversion. "Fire!" someone screamed. The saloon emptied as men poured into the street, some to fight the fire, others to flee the unseen shooter. The Clanton gang, their instincts screaming at them to run, made for their horses. One-Eyed Jack was the first to swing into his saddle. The moment his weight settled, his horse screamed in pain from the hidden burrs and exploded into a bucking, spinning frenzy. One by one, as the other gang members mounted, their horses did the same. The street devolved into a whirlwind of chaos, panicked horses, shouting men, and the growing roar of the fire. And through it all, Lena remained in the shadows, her rifle at the ready. She wasn't looking for a massacre. She was looking for a target. She saw him. Grizzly, the mountain of a man, had been thrown from his horse and was trying to bring the terrified animal under control. He was exposed, a perfect shot. She aimed not for his head or his heart, but for his leg. She fired. The bullet tore through his thigh, and he went down with a roar of pain and fury, clutching the mangled limb. She had taken their biggest, most physically intimidating member out of the fight without killing him. A wounded man was a burden. A wounded man was a constant, moaning reminder of their vulnerability. She slipped away as silently as she had come, melting back into the night. She had fired 3 shots. With them, she had destroyed their sense of security, crippled their strongest men, and sown the seeds of terror in their hearts. Back in their trash saloon, as they tended to Grizzly's wound, One-Eyed Jack stared at the playing card with the hole in it. The whispers were starting now. The story of Smiley Pete's strange death suddenly seemed less random. They were being hunted, not by the law, but by a ghost. A ghost who shot with impossible accuracy, who could turn their own horses against them, who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The ghost of Purgatory Flats. Fear, for the first time, had found its way into the camp of the Clanton gang. Fear is a corrosive acid. In the days that followed the chaos in Purgatory Flats, it began to eat away at the iron bonds of the Clanton gang. They left town in a hurry, dragging the groaning, feverish Grizzly on a makeshift travois. They rode hard, constantly looking over their shoulders, flinching at the sound of a hawk's cry or the rustle of the wind. The vast, open prairie no longer felt like a haven of freedom. It felt like a trap, and they were the prey. One-Eyed Jack Clanton was a predator, not a victim, and the feeling of being hunted was an intolerable insult. This ghost, this widow, was making a mockery of him. In the grimy border town of Tres Cruces, he decided to fight fire with fire. He couldn't catch a ghost with his pack of spooked thugs. He needed a professional. He needed a man who could track a shadow through the dark. He needed Jedediah Kane. The name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones from the saloons of the borderlands to the mining camps of the north. Kane was not a common bounty hunter who chased petty criminals for poster money. He was a specialist, a man-tracker of legendary skill. It was said he could follow a trail across bare rock and could read a man's life story from a single footprint. He worked for exorbitant fees, and he never, ever failed. Jack sent a rider with a bag heavy with gold and a simple message, $5,000 for the ghost of Purgatory Flats. Alive. I want to look her in the eye before I kill her myself. The news of the bounty reached Lena circuitously. She had been shadowing the gang, keeping her distance, a persistent and seen pressure. In a small trading post, while posing as a homesteader's wife looking for her strayed husband, she overheard 2 trappers talking about the incredible bounty One-Eyed Jack had placed on the phantom that was haunting his gang. They described the target as a she-devil with the shooting eye of an angel and the cunning of a coyote. A cold knot formed in Lena's stomach. Jedediah Kane. Elias had spoken of him once. He's not a lawman, and not an outlaw, Elias had said. He's something else. A force of nature. If he's ever on your trail, don't run. You'll only die tired. The game had changed. Lena was no longer just the hunter. She was now the hunted. She immediately broke from the Clanton's trail and headed for the most difficult, treacherous terrain she knew, the Badlands. It was a maze of sun-baked canyons, jagged rock spires, and dead-end gullies, a place where water was a memory and the sun was a hammer. It was a landscape designed to kill the careless, and she hoped it would be enough to lose even the legendary Jedediah Kane. For 2 days, she rode through the hellish landscape, using every trick Elias had ever taught her. She rode through shallow streams to hide her tracks, dismounted and walked across stretches of bare rock, and backtracked to lay false trails. But on the third morning, she knew she was not alone. She saw no one. She heard no one. But she felt it. A prickling on the back of her neck, a sense of being watched. She found a high vantage point, concealing herself in a narrow crevice between 2 rocks, and scanned her back trail with the spyglass. For hours, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the rocks. Then, she saw him. He was a mile back, a lone rider on a dark horse, moving with an unhurried, economical grace. He was not following her tracks. He seemed to be following her intent, anticipating her movements. He would pause, survey the landscape not with his eyes, but with an almost animal instinct, and then proceed directly along the path she had taken, ignoring her false trails as if they were signposts pointing the correct way. It was Jedediah Kane. A new kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Lena's grief-fueled resolve. This was a man who played her own game, and he was a master. Running was pointless. She had to turn the tables. She had to make the hunter walk into her trap. She found the perfect spot, a narrow, winding canyon, its walls so steep they blotted out the sun. There was only one way in and one way out. She rode a half-mile into the canyon, then carefully dismounted and led her horse into a small, hidden side ravine, muffling its nostrils to keep it from making a sound. Then she climbed. Her fingers and toes found purchase on the sheer rock face, a skill learned from exploring the mesas with Elias. She climbed until she was perched on a narrow ledge, 30 feet above the canyon floor, her Winchester rifle resting before her. She was completely concealed from below. Now, all she could do was wait. Hours passed. The heat in the canyon was stifling. Her mouth was dry, and sweat stung her eyes. But she did not move. She became a part of the rock, her patience absolute. Finally, she heard the soft clop of a single horse. Jedediah Kane rode into the canyon, his pace unhurried. He was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He paused directly below her, his gaze sweeping the canyon walls. For a terrifying moment, Lena thought he had seen her. His eyes seemed to lock directly onto her position. But then he dismounted, walking forward to examine the tracks she had deliberately left. He knelt, studying the ground. This was her chance. "They say you're the best, Kane," Lena's voice echoed strangely in the confined space. He didn't jump. He didn't even flinch. He simply remained kneeling, his head tilted as if listening to a faint sound. "They say a lot of things," he replied, his voice a low, hum rasp. "Most of them are true. Then you should have known this was a trap." He finally looked up, his sharp eyes pinpointing her location instantly. He showed no surprise, only a kind of professional curiosity. "It's a good one," he conceded. "The widow Thorne. Your husband was a good man." "A shame. Don't you speak his name," Lena hissed, the rifle steady in her hands. $5,000 is a lot of money, ma'am," Kane said, slowly rising to his feet. His hands kept carefully away from the pistol on his hip. "Enough to start a new life. Far away from here." "The only new life I'm interested in is the one I Jack will be starting in hell," she retorted. "And he's taking his friends with him." "A noble sentiment," Kane said, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes. "But you've made a mistake. You think I'm like them." He took a slow step towards his horse. "Don't move," Lena warned. He ignored her. "You see, Mrs. Thorne, Clanton paid me to bring you in alive." He was very specific about that. He reached his horse. "He never said a word about what condition I had to be in." In a single, fluid motion so fast it blurred, he was not reaching for his gun. He grabbed a rifle from its scabbard on his saddle and dove behind his horse for cover. At the same time, Lena fired. Her bullet tore through the horse's neck, and the animal went down with a terrible scream. Kane was already rolling, coming up firing his own rifle from the hip. Bullets ricocheted off the rock around Lena, spraying her with stone chips. She ducked back, her heart hammering. He was impossibly fast. She had lost the advantage. This was not a fight she could win. She scrambled from her ledge, working her way back down the rock face as Kane laid down a volley of suppressing fire. Reaching her horse, she leaped into the saddle and spurted out of the side ravine and down the canyon, away from the fight. She was not running in defeat, she was making a strategic retreat. She risked a glance back. Kane was not pursuing. He was standing over his dead horse, a grim look on his face. She had escaped, but at a cost. He now knew her face, her skills, and her resolve. And she knew that Elias had been right. Jedediah Kane was not like the others. He was her equal. The hunt had become a duel, and the Badlands were not big enough for both of them. The bullet from Jedediah Kane's rifle hadn't struck true, but it hadn't missed entirely. It had torn a hot, ragged furrow across Lena's left forearm, a burning reminder of her mistake. The wound was not deep, but it was bleeding sluggishly, and in the filth of the wilderness, even a small wound could fester and kill. More than that, her encounter with the bounty hunter had left her shaken. He was a different breed from the Clanton thugs. He was methodical, intelligent, and just as relentless as she was. To continue her hunt, she needed two things: medical attention and better information. She couldn't afford to be surprised again. Her map showed a small settlement 50 miles south, a place Elias had once pointed out with a grimace. Scabs Creek, he'd called it. It's a town that exists between the lines. Not on the main stage route, not big enough for a marshal. It's where people go to get stitched up, no questions asked, or to hear whispers they shouldn't. It was a dangerous place, but it was exactly what she needed. She arrived after a day and a half of hard riding, the pain in her arm a dull, constant throb. The town was little more than a dozen decrepit buildings huddled around a muddy, foul-smelling creek. Its inhabitants had the hard, wary eyes of people with something to hide. She rode directly to the building with a crude, hand-painted sign depicting a saw and a bottle. Doc Holloway. The inside of the office smelled of whiskey, carbolic acid, and old blood. The man behind the desk was stooped and thin, with a perpetually cynical expression and fingers stained with nicotine and silver nitrate. This was Doc Holloway, the town's only medical authority and, it was rumored, its primary confessor and information broker. He looked up from a medical journal, his eyes lingering on the rifle she carried, then on the bloody, makeshift bandage on her arm. "Trouble find you, or did you go looking for it?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "A little of both," Lena replied, placing a silver dollar on his desk. "I need you to patch this up. And I need to know what you've heard about the Clanton gang." Holloway's eyes narrowed at the mention of the name. He picked up the coin and pocketed it. "Stitching costs $1. Information costs more." He motioned for her to sit, and began to clean the wound with a cloth soaked in whiskey, making her hiss in pain. "Clanton's crew passed through here a few days back. They were riding with a wounded man, and they were spooked. Said a ghost was on their trail. Then a man named Kane came through, asking about a woman with a Winchester. He didn't seem spooked at all. Seems to me you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, miss." "I know that," Lena said through gritted teeth as he threaded a needle. "What I don't know is where Clanton is going." Holloway tied off the last stitch. "That kind of information is expensive. Dangerous. Why should I tell you?" Lena looked him dead in the eye. "Because my husband was U.S. Marshal Elias Thorne. And he told me that he once had a Doc Holloway dead to rights for patching up a bank robber, and he let him go. Said the doc was more useful to the world practicing medicine than breaking rocks in Yuma." The doctor froze, his cynical mask cracking for just a moment. He remembered. A flash of gratitude, long buried under years of cynicism, flickered in his eyes. He owed Elias a debt. "Your husband was a good man," Holloway said quietly. "Too good for this world." He sighed, then made a decision. "All right, I'll tell you. But it's not a gift. It's a trade. A devil's bargain." He explained the situation. A large shipment of medical supplies, including precious quinine for malaria, was due to arrive on the weekly stagecoach. However, a local brute named Silas Croft, who ran a protection racket in Scabs Creek, had decided the shipment belonged to him. He and his two loutish sons were planning to seize it, to sell the medicine at an exorbitant price. The town was too scared to stand up to him. "I don't have the muscle to stop him," Holloway said. "But you do. You get my medicine off that coach, safe and sound, and I'll tell you everything I heard from Clanton's nervous young recruit while I was plying him with laudanum for his toothache." It was a distraction from her mission, but it was the only path forward. Lena agreed. When the stagecoach arrived the next day, Silas Croft and his sons were waiting, armed with shotguns. The driver and guard, seeing the odds, raised their hands in surrender. Croft left, a greasy, triumphant sound, as he moved towards the strong box containing the medicine. "That doesn't belong to you," Lena said. She stood in the middle of the street, 20 yards away, the Winchester held casually at her hip. Croft turned, his face twisting into a sneer. "Well, look what we have here. A little lady with a big gun. Get lost, before you get hurt." "I'm only going to say this once," Lena said, her voice carrying with cold clarity. "Leave the medicine and ride out of this town. Don't come back." Croft laughed again and raised his shotgun. But he had made the same mistake as all the others. He had underestimated the woman standing before him. Lena fired the Winchester from her hip. The shot was not aimed at his chest, but at his hand. The bullet tore the shotgun from his grasp with a crack of splintered wood and a scream of pain from Croft. Before his sons could even react, she had levered another round and fired twice more in rapid succession. One shot hit the ground by the first son's feet, sending him hopping back in terror. The second shattered the whiskey bottle the other son was holding, spraying him with glass and liquor. It was over in 3 seconds. They were disarmed and demoralized, utterly terrified of the woman who had surgically dismantled them without shedding a drop of blood. Silas Croft clutched his broken hand, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Lena simply stood there, the rifle smoking, her expression as cold and unforgiving as a winter morning. The Crofts scrambled for their horses and fled Scabs Creek without a backward glance. That evening, in his office, Doc Holloway held up his end of the bargain. "The kid, Billy, was terrified of the ghost," he began. He said, "Jack's got one last big score planned. The U.S. Army payroll train. It's carrying 50,000 in gold to Fort Defiance. It has to pass through Serpent's Pass, a narrow canyon, 3 days from now. Jack knows the schedule. He plans to blow the tracks, rob the train, and then the whole gang will split up and disappear into Mexico for good." Holloway slid a map across the table, tapping a spot with his stained finger. "Serpent's Pass. If you're going to stop them, it has to be there." Lena looked at the map. For the first time since Elias's death, she had more than just a trail to follow. She had a destination, a final battlefield. She knew the Clanton gang would be there, and she had a sinking feeling that a man like Jedediah Kane, knowing the bounty was about to ride a train to Mexico, would be there too. The pass was not just a place for an ambush. It was a place for a reckoning. Serpent's Pass was aptly named. It was a treacherous, winding canyon that snaked through the sun-blasted rock of the Dragoon Mountains. The railway line, a marvel of engineering and a lifeline for the territory, clung precariously to the canyon's eastern wall, a thin iron ribbon stretched over a 100-foot drop. It was a perfect natural bottleneck, an ideal place for an ambush. For Lena, it was the place where everything would end. She arrived a full day before the payroll train was due, giving her time to scout the terrain and understand the battlefield. She left her horse miles away, hidden in a box canyon with water and forage, and proceeded on foot, carrying only her rifle, her revolver, and a small pack with water, ammunition, and a length of rope. She moved with the patience of a predator, her eyes scanning every rock, every shadow, every possible vantage point. She was not just planning her attack on the Clantons, she was planning her defense against Jedediah Kane. She knew he would be here. This was the final, inevitable nexus for all of them. She found the Clantons' camp on the western rim of the canyon, opposite the tracks. They had chosen their spot well, a rocky outcropping that offered a commanding view of the pass. She saw the heavy wooden crates, undoubtedly filled with dynamite, and the spool of detonator wire. Their plan was brutally simple: blow the tracks as the train entered the narrowest part of the pass, sending it crashing to the canyon floor, then descend to pick through the wreckage. But it was not the gang that drew her primary focus. Her instincts were screaming, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Kane was here, somewhere. He was not with the Clantons. He was a lone wolf, not a pack animal. He would be watching them, just as she was. He was the hawk, circling high above, waiting for the rattlesnakes to strike so he could swoop in and claim his own prize. She spent hours searching for him, not with her eyes, but with her mind. Where would he be? Where was the perfect spot for a man who wanted to watch everyone but be seen by no one? Elias had taught her to think like her enemy. Kane was a hunter. He would want the high ground, a position with a clear line of sight, and multiple escape routes. She found him just as the sun began to set, its last rays painting the canyon walls in fiery colors. He was on a high, isolated spire of rock nearly half a mile away, a position that gave him a perfect view of both the Clantons' camp and the entire length of the pass where the ambush would occur. He was just a tiny silhouette against the dying light, but she knew it was him. He was patient. He was waiting. Lena realized then that she could not simply fight a two-front war. She had to use one enemy to neutralize the other. Kane was the greater threat. He was her intellectual and tactical equal. The Clantons were just brutal thugs. If she could turn the hawk and the rattlesnakes against each other, she might have a chance to survive. Her new plan was audacious and incredibly risky. She needed to create a situation where Kane would be forced to reveal himself to the Clantons, a situation where he would become a more immediate and visible threat than the ghost they couldn't see. Under the cover of complete darkness, she began her work. She descended into the canyon, her movements silent and sure-footed. She found the spot where the gang had planted their dynamite, tucked into a fissure in the rock beneath the tracks. The detonator wires ran from the charge, across the canyon floor, and up the western wall to the Clantons' perch. She did not cut the wires. Instead, she took her knife and carefully scraped away a small section of the gutta-percha insulation from each of the two wires, exposing the copper beneath. She then retreated, paying out a thin, almost invisible strand of her own wire, which she connected to the exposed sections. She ran this new wire not towards her own position, but across the canyon and up towards the base of the rock spire where Jedediah Kane was hidden. She didn't connect it to anything. She simply left the bear and tucked into a crevice in the rock, 20 feet below his perch. It was a piece of a puzzle that made no sense on its own. It was bait. Her final preparation was the most important. She found her own position, a narrow cave hollowed out of the canyon wall by ancient waters. It was directly across from the ambush site, offering a perfect, unobstructed view. It was a sniper's nest. From here, she could see the dynamite charge, the Clantons' camp, and the spire where Kane was hidden. She was the ghost in the machine, the unseen hand ready to pull the strings. As dawn approached, she settled in, checking her rifle, laying out her ammunition. The stage was set. All she had to do now was wait for the actors to take their places for the final, bloody act. The morning air was still and cool, thick with anticipation. From her cave, Lena watched as the Clanton gang moved into their final positions. Two men, including the nervous young kid, Billy, were sent down to the canyon floor to act as lookouts and to confirm the dynamite charge was secure. The rest of the gang, led by One-Eye Jack, remained on the rim, their rifles resting on the rocks, their eyes fixed on the northern end of the pass. Jack himself held the detonator, a simple plunger box, with a proprietary grip. Lena scanned the distant spire with her spyglass. Kane was still there, a motionless statue of patience. He had likely seen the Clanton lookouts descend, but it would have meant nothing to him. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Their plan, not hers. The low, mournful wail of a train whistle echoed through the mountains. It was coming. A palpable tension fell over the canyon. Lena could feel it, a physical presence in the air. The Clanton men on the rim checked their weapons. Down below, the two lookouts flattened themselves behind a cluster of boulders. The train chugged into view, a black iron beast belching smoke, pulling a single armored payroll car and a caboose. It moved slowly, cautiously, as it entered the narrowest part of the pass. One-Eye Jack raised his hand, waiting for the engine to pass directly over the dynamite charge. This was the moment. But just as he was about to slam the plunger down, Lena acted. From her hidden position, she fired her Winchester. The shot was not aimed at Jack or any of his men. It was aimed at a small, flat rock just beside the head of the lookout, Billy, on the canyon floor. The bullet ricocheted with a high-pitched scream, showering Billy with rock fragments. He yelled in terror and surprise, instinctively firing his own rifle in a panic. His wild shot flew harmlessly across the canyon and smacked into the rock spire, 20 feet below where Jedediah Kane was perched. It was the spark that lit the fuse of chaos. From his vantage point, all Kane knew was that a shot had been fired from the canyon floor, and a bullet had just hit his position. His professional instincts took over. He saw the muzzle flash from Billy's rifle and assumed he was the target of a Clanton double-cross. He raised his own rifle and fired a single, precise shot. Down on the canyon floor, Billy screamed and collapsed, clutching a shattered shoulder. The effect on One-Eye Jack and his men was immediate and absolute. They saw their men go down, shot by a hidden sniper. They looked in the direction of the shot and saw the muzzle flash from Kane's spire. They had no idea who was up there. They only knew they were being attacked. "We've been set up," one of them screamed. "It's the law," yelled another. "Kill him," roared One-Eye Jack, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He and his men turned their attention away from the train and opened fire on Kane's position, unleashing a volley of lead at the distant rock spire. The train, its engineer now fully aware of the ambush, blasted its whistle and began to pick up speed, desperate to get through the pass. Lena watched the beautiful, deadly ballet she had choreographed unfold. The Clantons were now completely engaged in a firefight with a man they thought was a lawman. Kane, trapped on his exposed spire, was forced to defend himself against a full-scale assault. The hunter and the rattlesnakes were at each other's throats. But Lena's work was not done. In the midst of the chaos, she saw One-Eye Jack, driven by greed and desperation, turn back to the detonator. He was going to blow the tracks anyway, hoping to salvage something from the disaster. Lena took a deep, steadying breath. This was the most important shot of her life. She aimed not for Jack, but for the small wooden box in his hands. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet, fired from over 300 yards, struck the detonator box with a sharp crack of splintering wood. The box flew from Jack's hands, a tangled mess of wires and ruined mechanics. The train, now almost clear of the ambush zone, steamed past the useless dynamite charge and continued on its way safe. One-Eye Jack stared at his empty, stinging hands, then at the disappearing train, a look of utter disbelief and incandescent rage on his face. His plan was in ruins, his prize was gone, and his men were being picked off by a sniper he couldn't see. He looked up at the rock spire, the source of his woes, and screamed a wordless curse into the wind. He didn't know that his real enemy was hidden across the canyon, watching him through the sights of a Winchester rifle. The triad was now broken. The train was safe. The hawk and the rattlesnakes were locked in a deadly battle, and the ghost was finally free to begin her harvest. The canyon had become a shooting gallery. Kane, a master of survival, used his meager cover to its full advantage, his shots precise and deadly. He picked off another of the Clanton men on the rim, a clean shot to the chest that sent the man tumbling backward. The gang, now reduced in number and consumed by panic, fired wildly, their shots doing little more than chipping away at the rock around their unseen enemy. This was Lena's moment. With the gang's attention completely fixed on Kane, she slipped from her cave and began to move, using the chaos as cover. She did not head for the rim. She descended to the canyon floor. Her targets were the two men down below, the wounded Billy and his partner. She moved like a wraith through the boulders and scrub, her Schofield now in her hand. The second lookout, his attention focused on the firefight above, never saw her coming. She was on him in a flash, the butt of her revolver striking him hard behind the ear. He collapsed without a sound. She turned to Billy, who was trying to crawl to cover, his face pale with pain and fear. He looked up and saw her standing over him, and his eyes went wide with terror. He recognized the ghost from his nightmares. "Please," he whimpered. "Don't kill me. Where is Jack going when this is over?" Lena's voice was cold, devoid of pity. "Where is his bolt hole?" The kid was broken. He told her everything. An old, abandoned mine, the widow's well, about 5 miles south. It was their prearranged fallback point. "Thank you, Billy," Lena said. She did not shoot him. She simply took his pistol and left him there, wounded and disarmed. Her promise was to see the men who killed Elias in the ground, but she was a judge, not a butcher. This one was a child who had followed a wolf. His life of fear and pain would be its own kind of prison. She climbed the western wall, ascending at an angle that kept her out of the line of fire. She reached the rim just as the firefight was reaching its climax. Kane had managed to wound another of the Clanton men, and the remaining outlaws were starting to break. They had had enough. Two of them scrambled for their horses and fled, riding south. One-Eye Jack, seeing his gang disintegrate, let out a final, furious roar and fired his last bullets at the spire before turning to run for his own horse. Now, only One-Eye Jack remained. Lena watched as he mounted his horse, a powerful black stallion. He was not fleeing with the others. He was heading south, towards the Widow's Wail mine. Lena had a choice. She could try for a long-distance shot now, but he was a moving target. Or she could follow him, and end this where it began in the dark, face to face. It was not a choice. This had to be personal. She made her way back to her own horse, her movements swift and silent. As she rode south, she glanced back at the rock spire. She saw no sign of Jedediah Kane. He had either been hit, or he had slipped away during the chaos. She knew in her gut it was the latter. He was not done, but he was no longer her primary concern. There was only one name left on her ledger now, One-Eye Jack Clanton. The final debt was about to be collected. The entrance to the Widow's Wail mine was a dark, jagged maw in the side of a granite cliff face, looking like a scream frozen in stone. Discarded ore carts and rotting timbers littered the entrance, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and forgotten things. One-Eye Jack's black stallion was tied to a dead tree nearby, its sides heaving. He was here. He was trapped. Lena dismounted, leaving her horse a safe distance away. She approached the mine entrance with her Schofield in one hand and a bundle of tallow candles and matches in the other. She was not just entering a mine, she was entering his tomb. She lit a candle, its small flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. The main tunnel plunged deep into the mountain. Old, rickety tracks ran along the floor, disappearing into the gloom. The only sounds were the dripping of water and the faint scuttling of unseen things. Clanton, her voice echoed through the tunnel, a ghostly summons. It's over. The rest of your men are dead or gone. It's just you and me now. A gunshot answered her, the report deafening in the confined space. The bullet whizzed past her head and thudded into a support beam. You'll have to do better than that. You witch, his voice roared from the darkness. You want me? Come and get me. The hunt was on. This was not the open prairie. This was a dark, claustrophobic labyrinth. She blew out her candle, plunging the tunnel into absolute blackness. Her other senses took over. Elias had taught her this, too. They had practiced in their root cellar on moonless nights, learning to navigate and fight by sound and touch. Most men are afraid of the dark, he'd said. Learn to make it your friend, and you'll always have an ally. She moved forward, one hand on the tunnel wall, her boots silent on the dusty ground. She could hear his ragged breathing, his shuffling movements somewhere ahead. He was the one making noise. He was the one who was afraid. She lit another candle and threw it down a side tunnel. As it clattered to the ground, casting flickering shadows, Clanton fired again at the sound and the light. In the brief flash of his muzzle, Lena saw him, crouched behind an overturned ore cart 50 yards down the main tunnel. She didn't fire back. She now knew his position. She remained in the darkness, a silent predator. She began to circle, finding a parallel shaft that, according to the feel of the rock and the flow of the air, should connect back to the main tunnel behind him. You killed a good man, Jack, she called out, her voice seeming to come from all directions at once. He was a husband and a homesteader. He'd put the law behind him. He was a rat who sent me to rot in a cage, he screamed back, his voice tight with rage and fear. He got what he deserved. And now you'll get what you deserve, she answered, her voice now seeming to come from behind him. He spun around, firing wildly into the darkness he now faced. He was wasting his ammunition. He was wasting his nerve. Lena emerged from the side tunnel, just as she had calculated. She was behind him. She lit her final candle, its flame revealing her standing there, 20 feet away, her Schofield leveled at his back. It's over, Jack, she said quietly. He spun around, his face a mask of sweat and grime, his one eye wide with feral terror. He raised his pistol to fire, but he was too slow. Lena fired once. The shot was not for his heart. It was for the ivory grip peacemaker tucked into his belt. Her bullet struck the trigger guard of Elias's gun, the impact tearing it from his grasp and sending it skittering across the mine floor. She had disarmed him of the last thing he had stolen from her. He stared at his empty holster, then at her, his bravado finally crumbling, replaced by a pathetic, whimpering fear. At that moment, a calm, steady voice spoke from the entrance of the mine. "Drop the gun, Mrs. Thorne." Jedediah Kane stood there, silhouetted against the daylight, his own pistol aimed steadily at her. He was bruised and scraped, but very much alive. "The bounty is for you, alive," Kane said, his voice echoing in the tunnel. "Not for him. Drop it, and we can walk out of here." One-Eye Jack saw his chance. A flicker of hope ignited in his eye. "That's right, law dog," he crowed. "Shoot the witch. I'll pay you double." Lena stood frozen, trapped between the man who had murdered her husband and the man who was paid to capture her. For a moment, it seemed her quest for vengeance would end in failure, just inches from the finish line. The standoff held for a long, silent moment, the only sound the faint drip of water somewhere in the mine's dark heart. Lena's gaze flickered from Kane's steady gun to Clanton's sneering face. This was the ultimate test. "He's a murderer, Kane," Lena said, her voice low and steady, never taking her eyes off Jack. "He and his men butchered my husband in his own yard. For nothing. There is no bounty that can wash that blood away." "The price is the price," Kane stated, his face unreadable. "It's my business, not my place to judge." "Isn't it?" Lena countered. "You saw what they were. You chose to accept the gold of a man like that. What does that make you?" A flicker of something doubt, perhaps, or a shadow of an old conscience crossed Kane's face. He had tracked murderers and thieves his entire life, but he had always operated under a cold, professional code. This felt different. He had seen the way she fought, the righteous fire that drove her. He had known Elias Thorne by reputation. He knew she was not the criminal. One-Eye Jack, sensing Kane's hesitation, decided to force the issue. With a desperate snarl, he lunged for Elias's peacemaker, lying on the ground between them. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Kane shouted, "No." But Lena did not hesitate. She did not look at Kane. She did not weigh her options. She fulfilled her promise. She fired the Schofield. The shot was clean, precise, and final. It struck One-Eye Jack Clanton square in the chest, throwing him backward against the wall of the mine. He slid to the floor, his one eye wide with the ultimate surprise, and then was still. The silence that followed was absolute. Lena stood over the body, smoke curling from the barrel of her revolver. She had done it. Every name was crossed off the ledger. The rage, the fire that had driven her for so long, finally flickered and died, leaving behind only the vast, cold ocean of her grief. She felt nothing but a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. Slowly, she lowered her gun. She turned to face Jedediah Kane, fully expecting his bullet. She was ready for it. Her war was over. Kane stood at the entrance, his pistol still raised. He looked from her to the dead man on the floor, then back to her. He saw not a killer, but a woman who had served a justice the law could never have provided. He saw the end of a long and bloody road. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hammer and holstered his pistol. "The bounty," he said, his voice a low rasp, "was for the ghost of Purgatory Flats. A killer who was terrorizing the territory." He looked around the dark, silent mine. "I don't see any ghost in here. All I see is a homesteader's wife defending herself." My trail went cold. "Looks like I'll have to return Clanton's gold." Lena stared at him, unable to speak. He was giving her a choice. He was giving her life. He turned to leave, then paused. "Elias Thorne was a good man," he said, without looking back. "The world is poorer for his loss. I suspect he would have been proud of you." And with that, Jedediah Kane walked out of the mine and out of her life. Lena was left alone in the darkness with the dead and the ghosts. She walked over and picked up Elias's peacemaker, its ivory grip cool against her skin. She holstered it, and for the first time, it felt truly hers. She walked out of the Widow's Wail mine and into the bright and forgiving sunlight. She did not know where she would go. The homestead was a ruin of memories and ashes. The woman she had been was gone forever, but she was alive. She was free. She mounted her horse and looked out at the vast, open horizon. Her grief was still with her, and would be forever. It was the price of her love for Elias. But it was no longer a weapon. It was just a part of her. The ledger was closed. The silence after the storm had finally ended. And for the first time in a long time, she could hear the sound of the wind in the grass, and it sounded like a new beginning.